Penguin Random House Audio presents Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. This is the author, Larry Diamond. Dedication to Zinmar Ong, Vladimir Karamurza, Mina Ki, Rafael Marquez de Marias, Kara McCormick, Nicholas Opio, Joshua Wong, and the many other unsung heroes of the struggle for democracy. Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. Alexander Hamilton, 1787. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. John F. Kennedy, 1961. The desire for liberty may be ingrained in every human breast, but so is the potential for complacency, confusion, and cowardice. Madeleine Albright, 2018. Chapter 1. Introduction. The Crisis. No cause is left but the most ancient of all, the one, in fact, that from the beginning of our history has determined the very existence of politics, the cause of freedom versus tyranny. Hannah Arendt, On Revolution, 1963. On a gray Sunday afternoon, 2 days before the November 2016 U.S. election, I entered the Berkeley Repertory Theater with 20 Stanford students to see the final performance of a production of It Can't Happen Here. Adapted from the classic 1935 novel by Sinclair Lewis, the play traces the rise of an ultranationalist demagogue who, in the midst of the Great Depression, snatches the 1936 Democratic presidential nomination away from Franklin Roosevelt, wins the presidency, and establishes a dictatorship in the United States. In the novel, Lewis memorably describes his authoritarian ruler, Buzz Windrop. Certainly there was nothing exhilarating in the actual words of his speeches, nor anything convincing in his philosophy. His political platforms were only wings of a windmill. There were two things that distinguished this prairie Demosthenes. He was an actor of genius. He would whirl arms, bang tables, glare from mad eyes, and, in between tricks, would coldly and almost contemptuously jab his crowds with figures and facts that were inescapable even when, as often happened, they were entirely incorrect. The parallels to Donald Trump, the 2016 Republican candidate for President of the United States, were too stark to ignore. I watched the play with a level of anxiety I hadn't expected even a few weeks before, and didn't want to fully share with the students. They were also shaken by the drama, but we reassured ourselves with the obvious facts. The play was a time-bound work of fiction. Roosevelt had been re-elected in 1936. The United States wasn't sunk into anything close to a depression. Trump wasn't an actual fascist. And in any case, he wasn't going to win on Tuesday, right? When the Berkeley Rep began writing its new stage adaptation of the novel in January 2016, no primary election votes had yet been cast. There was no reason to expect that a modern-day demagogue could win the nomination of a major American political party. Indeed, since Trump had declared his candidacy in 2015, I'd spent more than a year reassuring people around the world that it couldn't happen here in the United States. First, I assured them that Trump had no serious chance of winning the Republican nomination. Then I told them that he had scant chance of winning the general election. To Democratic activists gathered in Seoul for the World Movement for Democracy Assembly in November 2015, to Vietnamese dissidents who had come to Taiwan to watch the January 2016 presidential election there, to college students and civic activists in Hong Kong who had organized the 2014 Umbrella Movement protests against Chinese repression, to students, professors, journalists, and legislators in Burma and Argentina. I repeated it over and over. It won't happen in the United States. Our institutions were too strong, I insisted, to permit a reality TV star with no prior government experience to win a major party nomination for president, much less the Oval Office. Our democratic norms were too resilient to produce a president who crudely demeaned the press, the judiciary, and immigrants, who encouraged his supporters to physically attack protesters and to scream for his opponent to be locked up, who refused to release his tax returns, and who appealed in thinly veiled code to base racist sentiments. I wasn't naive. I knew that lying, race-baiting, and dirty tricks had long played their roles in presidential politics. I knew that unscrupulous men had won the office. But Trump would be a wholly new and almost unimaginable low. Polarized and unsettled though America's voters were, I didn't believe they could elect a man who, in the words of The Guardian's Jonathan Friedland, mocked opponents for their looks, belittled women, disparaged war heroes, damned ethnic and other minorities in crude, bigoted language, jeered at disabled people, beat his chest with bellicose promises of state-sponsored violence that would trample on the U.S. Constitution and trigger a third world war, and told dozens and dozens of lies every day. I was wrong, and so were most of my fellow political scientists and scholars of democracy. It was not simply the shock of Donald Trump's election that moved me to write this book. It was the anguished knowledge of what his presidency would mean for democracy around the world. Over 40 years of travel to more than 70 countries, I had gained a deep appreciation for the unique importance of the United States to the global struggle for freedom. Even people who resented America for its wealth, its global power, its arrogance, and its use of military force, nevertheless expressed a grudging admiration for the vitality of its democracy. Even those who were keenly aware of our tragic history of slavery, racism, inequality, and corporate monopolies marveled at the ability of American democracy to reform and renew itself. And the fiercest critics I encountered were, I found, often disarmed by an American speaker's readiness to criticize his government while praising its constitutional system. Wherever I met people struggling to achieve or build democracy, I heard the same hope, that the United States would somehow support their cause. Wherever I met dissidents risking everything to challenge corruption and oppression, I felt the heavy weight of moral expectation, that the United States would stand behind them and perhaps as a last resort give them refuge. And now we had elected a president whose worldview was America first, whose policies were rooted in contempt for immigrants and refugees, and whose rhetoric was suffused with praise for dictators. The timing of Trump's rise was particularly worrisome. For the past decade, I had been warning of a gathering tide of political corruption, polarization, and decay that was disillusioning ordinary citizens in many democracies and diminishing and destabilizing previously durable democratic systems. For most of that decade, and most of my career, I had been worried about the emerging or embattled democracies of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as well as the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?